how's it going? This is Matt Singleton with Bible Smack Radio. Trying a little bit of creativity today with the scenery, and then we ended up having to be a little bit more creative, so here we are. I'm responding today to a post by a channel called Canning Wired, and basically it was an interview with a Federal Vision pastor who is Doug Wilson, probably the most famous in that movement, which is not, the most famous movement ever. Very influential, though. John Piper really kind of takes a lot of his teachings based off of teachings of Doug Wilson. It's a group within the Presbyterian movement. So, as a result of that, it doesn't seem like it's much, but it kind of makes greater waves, because what will happen is that the Presbyterian teachings will affect the Calvinist Baptist teachings. That'll affect the greater Baptist denominations and stuff like that as it kind of flows throughout the country. Now, in that interview, basically Federal Vision in PCUSA was kind of deemed a false teaching and rejected, and so they had to start up new Presbyterian denominations. The problem is there is a charge that they've mixed up the law and the gospel, that they've confused grace with religion. And essentially what it is kind of like what I call a hyper-Calvinistic movement. Hyper-Calvinism is a common title that gets constantly argued over what the definition is of it. But basically, it takes some principles of Calvinism, and more specifically, determinism, predestination doctrines, and just basically kind of, takes it to an extent that is not evangelical. You'll notice in the video that he goes over some things, and I picked this video because that's their chance to kind of be as objective as they can be. And I wanted to kind of share some points on it. One is, of course, that they argue for, some basic Presbyterian teachings, which, I would argue as a New Testament Christian and also a Baptist minister, they're just not biblical. They're not accurate. And so the first thing is, like when they talk about the gospel, they talk about baptism and how an infant is covenantally bound, that you are to take someone who does not believe, and that you would put them in covenant with God. The new covenant, therefore, is like entered without faith. And they'll say that that person's not saved, and I'm not going to say that's what Doug is arguing. But let me go ahead and show you this passage in Hebrews, if I can real quick. Basically, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, it says, let's see here. Without faith, it says, verse 6, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is rewarded them that diligently seek him. So, the first issue is that, with infant baptism is not biblical, and it is a horrible covenant. And later on, he actually says something, this is kind of part of the confusion. He talks about a person who is baptized and never ever believes. He says, well, that's a ticket to hell. And I see that in Mark chapter 16, verse 16, where it says, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. And so basically you're condemned to hell, you're damned. There's no point to baptizing infants. The Bible doesn't say to baptize infants. There's not a single verse in the Bible where anybody baptizes an infant. But you see, what he's going with is he's kind of taking human traditions, things that are not of God, things that are not of the Bible, and he's basing his theology off of that. Then he confuses things, and that's one big problem. And you see, John Calvin is not nearly as confusing as what we see out of Doug Wilson and later on in the Baptist form of John Piper. He's very, John Calvin's very rational. He's just taken a few problems, but those problems have grown. Just like if you have a few termites in your house, after a couple of years, you'll have a lot of termites in your house, and before you know it, you'll destroy the entire structure. So this hyper-Calvinism is something that is not exactly what John Calvin was teaching, but it's a result of it. It's a hyper. It's a growing problem, and now that problem is getting to be false teaching. And how can baptizing an infant, this is a question I would have, how can baptizing an infant bind someone more than a non-baptized infant? What does that do exactly anyway? Another question is, how can you be baptized and not Christian? Baptism is the entrance into Christianity. We look in the book of Acts. Find that. And it says in Acts chapter 2:41, it says, "Then they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day were added unto them about 3,000 souls." So, once you get baptized, you're a member of the church, and you started off your religion, okay? So baptism is the start of the Christian religion. And there's a big difference between salvation and religion. Religion can only be the religion of the New Testament after you're saved. It cannot be before you're saved, because that is the religion that'll send you to hell, is the one that you do before you get saved. But you get saved, and that's a work of God to you. And then you join the church as part of religion, you worshiping God out of thankfulness. Now, another point is, how are you connected to Christ? If you're not connected through faith, if you're not connected through the gospel. They don't even practice baptism as is in the Bible. The word baptizo is the Greek word for baptism. Well, that's not a translation, that's a transliteration. Translation of the word baptize, or baptizo, is immersion. Okay, it's to get into that water. Okay, it's not just to kind of sprinkle a little bit. Is the sprinkling going to wash me clean? No. Okay, I need the whole enchilada. I need to get baptized. So, another issue is the new birth before faith. This is very popular in Reformed theology and Calvinism today. And I'm not an expert on John Calvin, but I've read some of his writings, and it seems to me that Calvin does not argue that you are born again prior to faith. He argues for something called the effectual call. And what it is that he believes that there are some people who are predestined to be saved and some who are not. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. That's Romans 1:16. Well, it's the power of God unto salvation, then why is it not saving everybody? Well, Calvin would say that only those who are predestinated will receive the effectual call. I would say that the issue is that you need to meet the call that comes through that gospel, that's the power of God into salvation, with faith. And I would base that off of, we go to Hebrews again in chapter 3. And it says, "Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle high priest." Make sure this is the right verse. Okay. Chapter 4 of Hebrews. It says, 4 verse 2, "For unto us was the gospel preached, as well unto them. But the word preached did not profit you, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it." So basically, the issue is that you have to have faith in the gospel. You have to trust the gospel. But Calvin goes on his own, and he kind of goes through and says, well, there's an effectual call. Well, there's not a whole lot of biblical stuff about effectual call, but there is biblical stuff about being born again. So later on, Puritans are going to go into this concept of like, well, you can't have faith unless you're born again. The problem with being born again, and we'll get to that on the second part.